Hey guys, Alex from Board Game Co. over here, and today we're doing another episode of Play This Not That. In Play This Not That, what I do is I pick two board games that have some degree of overlap or similarity, and then I go through them in brief, and then I tell you which one I think you should be playing. Now take it with a grain of salt, the loser is not necessarily a bad game, not by any means. In fact, I generally only try to play good games, so it's usually a good game, but I just feel one is better for me and possibly for you as well. Now just a disclaimer, if you haven't seen one of my other recent videos, I may or may not have COVID-19, but I definitely have something right now, so if I cough a little, bear with me. In any case, with today's episode, we are comparing Game of Thrones and Battle for Rokugan. Now, Game of Thrones is a game that I have been playing for a very long time, since well before I got into gaming, actually. My brother was a big fan of the books, and he got the original first edition of A Game of Thrones, the board game, the first edition, way back, and I remember playing it with him and my other siblings at the table, and enjoying the master giant board and interweaving politics and gameplay and all that. And then sure enough, when I got back into gaming, I saw that one, I remembered it, and they actually had come out with the second edition. So I got the second edition and made sure to get a whole bunch of games under my belt playing that one. Now, in Game of Thrones, what you're doing is you are controlling one of six, I believe it's one of six houses on the board. You take the position of one of six houses, and then you have to maneuver your entire everything, your politics, you have to maneuver your forces, your units, your sea, your land. You have to maneuver all your resources and everything that is available to you within the game in order to get victory. Now, this is a game that is simultaneously, one degree, it has an aspect of politics and negotiating with your opponents and trying to, or your allies. Negotiating and backstabbing your allies is a big deal, but also it has a large degree of trying to figure out the best way to build up an economy. You have to sit there and get more production on the board, so you have more resources, so you can build more units, and then you can in turn negotiate with your allies to try to take over control from that person who's currently winning, from in the north or the whoever, and then turning around and trying to win the game. Now, doing the game, you place these little tokens of doing the battle sequence. Before you actually go to the battle, you place planning tokens, which says what you're going to do with your units. So you put various planning tokens on the board, and then everyone reveals them one at a time, showing what they're actually going to do. So you're going to march, you're going to support, you're going to rally, you're going to attack. There's all these things you can do, and you're trying to sit there and negotiate. Either sometimes you're attacking that, I will attack you, and then someone has to go on the defensive, but in reality, you're actually just supporting your other units over here. There's a large degree of bluffing and control and negotiation and power going on in this game. And in Battle for Rokugan, takes the same idea of Game of Thrones, but distills it down to just that. It doesn't have everything else going on. It doesn't have large degrees of, controlling resources so you can build up better armies and adding your sea units and everything else. All Battle for Rokugan has is just that phase. It just has putting down various planning tokens that will define what you do as you flip them. The game takes place over multiple rounds, but ultimately it just distills that one aspect of Game of Thrones, puts its own spin on it, its own nuance in it, and delivers a much more compact game that is the same basic idea, but significantly more reduced, significantly more distilled down to one core set of mechanics. Now, Battle for Rokugan is a much more recent addition to my collection. I've only had it in my collection for maybe about a year and a half now, but I have played it a few times, and in today's episode of Play This Not That, Battle for Rokugan wins squarely, unfortunately. Or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. I say unfortunately because Game of Thrones has a soft spot in my heart and a soft spot in my collection in terms of how long I've actually been playing that game and what it represents, because I love Game of Thrones. I love the genre. And for what it's worth, as a disclaimer, I have not played the Mother of Dragons expansion for Game of Thrones, which from what I understand, everyone agrees that it makes the game better, from what I've seen at least, but there's still a disagreement as to whether it makes the game worth the playtime. Now, what I mean by that is Game of Thrones is an incredible game, but the reason Battle for Rokugan wins is threefold. Number one is Game of Thrones is long, and I mean long. It is a game that you have to know the game incredibly well to teach it. You have to convey those rules to people, and they're not intuitive. I've always said time and time again that there's a difference between a lot of rules that make sense and a lot of rules that you have to constantly remember and try to figure out what was that rule again? How did this combine with that? Game of Thrones is a game that it works, it does work, but the rules don't always mesh in a cohesive manner that makes them easy to recall, to understand, and to walk into the game knowing exactly what to do next. So you can teach it, but you'll have to constantly reteach some of those rules as the game goes on, because the players won't grok everything. They won't comprehend everything right away, and it's not always intuitive to pick it up. So it's a long rule session along with constant reminders combined with a super long game. So as much as I enjoy it, as much as I've enjoyed the gameplay of Game of Thrones, every time I've played it, I've simultaneously had a great time and felt it was too long. Both things are true. Secondly, is Game of Thrones sometimes stuffs players into a defined role in order to balance the game. One of the things that it always felt a little unfortunate is the roles in Game of Thrones. Starting factions aren't necessarily balanced. Players have to play a certain set of mini games almost of, well, this character has to ally with that in order to ally with that in order to balance the game. Otherwise, certain factions walk in stronger, and you're walking in with this idea that, well, if people don't gang up against that faction, he walks in with an advantage. And that doesn't feel right. I understand that there's this concept there of, players self-balancing the game and whatnot, and this can happen in games like Root and Cosmic Encounter, but for a game this long and this involved, I expect more. I don't want to walk into a 4-hour-long game where I have to play a certain role. At least in Root and Cosmic Encounter, those are significantly shorter games that it's less of a punishment to be forced into playing a role that the game defined for you in order to balance the game. And Cosmic Encounter, to be clear, it's a question of which role you get. It's not always. It's sometimes some roles are more powerful. But yeah, so I'm not a huge fan of that principle of the players balancing the game. I recognize there's a value to it when you're talking about small nuances, when you're talking about small discrepancies, but when you sit there and say this faction is clearly more powerful and the players have to balance the game, I have never been a fan of that level of obviousness. If it's nuanced, if you're talking about a game where someone says, well, this faction wins, 24% of the time compared to 22% of the time, fine, I get it. I'm not looking for a perfect I'm not looking for perfect win rates in an asymmetric game, and I understand that that's a sacrifice you have to make. But let's try to get as close as possible in order to actually feel like what we're doing is our choice and not what we had to do. And finally, number 3 is Battle for Rokugan just basically does the best part of Game of Thrones, but shorter. Now, similar to reason number 1 in terms of the game length, but it's what Battle for Rokugan took from me, the part of Game of Thrones that made Game of Thrones so enjoyable, and just made the whole game around that. Everything else Game of Thrones does, other games do better. Everything else. It's not that the other things are bad, it's that the other things are just nowhere near up to the standard I expect from modern board games. Game of Thrones is a good game with an amazing planning and traitorousness to it that makes it so enjoyable. But everything else is not as good as other games in that genre. There's better resource production, there's better unit management and whatnot, there's better card play in terms of the battle resolution. Game of Thrones is mostly a set of solid mechanics with one planning session of how you're actually going to reveal each token. What are you doing? What did you end up doing? What did you tell me you're going to do? What did you do in the end? What did you negotiate with me that I should do in order to backstab that guy? Battle for Rokugan does exactly the same. Battle for Rokugan does it better, I would argue, without anything else, without any of the extra unnecessary stuff. Battle for Rokugan takes the best part of Game of Thrones and lets you play it in an hour and a half. It's that simple to me. You took the best part of a game, lacking the theme, I guess, because I do like the Game of Thrones theme, but if you ignore theme for a second, which theme is a big deal, I would love to play Battle for Rokugan Game of Thrones edition, just in case anyone's taking notes out there, Fantasy Flight. If you can get that done, I'm all in. But that aside, Battle for Rokugan takes the best part of Game of Thrones, the best gameplay part of Game of Thrones, and puts the entire game around that. I would rather play Battle for Rokugan any single day because it just distills that one aspect of the game and delivers that entire game for you that way. And again, it does it better. Because it focuses on that one aspect, it knew it had to flesh it out a bit more. So they gave you a little more options and a little more intricacies in the way they interplay off of each other. So that's basically it. That is my opinion on Play This Not That. It is Battle for Rokugan over Game of Thrones today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know down below. What do you think? Have you played both? Have you played either? Did you keep one? Did you keep other? Oh, and to let you know, by the way, sadly Game of Thrones is not in my collection anymore. Like I said, it's a great game. It's the kind of game I'd probably play if you ever ask me to, but it's not a game I feel the need to own given all the reasons I mentioned already. I hope you enjoyed this video. You can subscribe to this video, you can like, ring the bell for notifications, comment down below, and if you want to support us, head on over to boardgameco.com, buy something, trade with us, sell your games to us, all that good stuff. And until next time, I'm Alex. Have a good one.